The Griffin family lived in Wildwood Hills, a picturesque small town known for its calm, tight-knit community. They were the kind of family people admired, polite, friendly, always willing to lend a hand. Margaret and Greg Griffin had built a comfortable life, one that centered around their only daughter, Emma. At 17, Emma was the pride of her family and the community. A straight-A student, a dedicated volunteer, and the kind of person you could trust to house-sit or watch the neighborhood children. She was, as people often said, the perfect daughter. But recently, Margaret had noticed subtle changes in Emma. At first, they seemed small, almost too trivial to mention. Emma would spend long hours alone in her room with the door locked, emerging only for meals and sometimes barely speaking during family dinners. She seemed distracted, her attention always somewhere else. And when she did speak, her responses were short, almost dismissive. Margaret brushed it off at first as teenage independence, or perhaps the pressures of applying to college. It was late one night, long after Greg had gone to bed, that Margaret heard footsteps outside her window. She peeked through the blinds to see Emma slipping out the front door, her figure blending into the shadows as she walked down the driveway and disappeared into the night. Heart pounding, Margaret watched for her daughter to return, sitting in the darkened living room until Emma crept back inside hours later, her face calm, almost expressionless. When Margaret confronted her the next morning, Emma's response was chillingly detached. "I just needed some fresh air," she said with a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Margaret wanted to push further, to ask where exactly Emma had gone, but the girl's cold, unwavering gaze unsettled her. Something about her daughter's response felt calculated, as if she had rehearsed it, expecting her mother's questions. Out in the world, Emma was still everyone's darling. She continued to excel in her classes and attend her volunteer shifts at the community center, where she was beloved by staff and patrons alike. Wildwood Hills saw her as a role model, the type of person any parent would be proud to raise. Teachers praised her dedication, neighbors admired her politeness, and friends looked up to her. Margaret watched as people continued to sing Emma's praises, each compliment hitting her with a strange sense of dread she couldn't quite understand. Greg noticed Margaret's unease and, sensing her discomfort, tried to reassure her. "She's growing up, Margie. They all go through phases. Remember when she was obsessed with that horror novel phase a couple of years ago? Teenagers have their quirks." Margaret nodded, trying to believe him. But her mother's intuition told her that this was different, that something had shifted inside Emma. She began paying closer attention, her concern growing each time Emma came home late without explanation or sat through a family meal in unsettling silence, as if her mind was elsewhere. One evening, Margaret decided to try something different. She set up an old board game, hoping it might bring Emma out of her shell and give them a chance to reconnect. When she invited her daughter to join her, Emma accepted with a shrug and sat down, staring at the board with a bored expression. As they played, Margaret tried to steer the conversation to Emma's friends and activities, hoping to learn more about her daughter's life. But each attempt was met with short, dismissive answers. "I'm fine, Mom," she said whenever Margaret asked if anything was troubling her. "It's just school. You know how it is." Margaret watched Emma's face as she spoke, her gaze unwavering and expression cool. She felt a pang of sadness, mourning the daughter she once knew. Emma's responses were careful, as if she were giving only enough information to end the conversation. But behind her words, there was a distinct lack of warmth, a sense of detachment that left Margaret feeling chilled. The following night, unable to sleep, Margaret found herself standing at the top of the stairs, watching the hallway to Emma's room. The light seeped out from under the door, casting an eerie glow across the floor. Margaret felt a sense of dread as she approached, hearing faint murmurs through the door. She leaned in closer, pressing her ear to the wood. Through the door, she could hear Emma's voice, low and steady, as if she were speaking to someone. "No, they don't suspect anything," Emma whispered, her tone oddly calm. "Yes, it's all under control." Margaret's pulse quickened. Who was Emma talking to? And what didn't they suspect? She wanted to burst in, to demand an explanation, but something held her back. She returned to her room, lying in bed beside Greg, her mind racing. Emma's words echoed in her mind as she wondered what was happening behind that closed door. In the days that followed, Margaret began noticing other strange behaviors. Emma's late-night disappearances became more frequent, and each time she returned, she seemed more distant, her gaze more unsettling. She started missing her volunteer shifts without explanation, and when Margaret asked her about it, Emma would brush it off with a casual excuse. Margaret noticed how her daughter's demeanor shifted when she thought no one was watching. Once, she caught Emma staring at her own reflection in the mirror, her face devoid of expression, as if she were studying herself, detached and unfeeling. When Margaret entered the room, Emma quickly looked away, her face slipping back into its familiar mask of warmth and politeness. Margaret couldn't shake the sense of dread that had settled in her gut over the past few weeks. Emma had always been her little girl, bright, kind, and full of life. But now, she was slipping away, becoming someone Margaret barely recognized. The once warm and loving daughter was now distant, cold, and secretive. Margaret tried to ignore her fears, chalking it up to teenage rebellion, but a persistent voice in the back of her mind told her otherwise. Something was deeply wrong. At first, Margaret tried to reconnect with Emma in small ways. She would invite her to family activities, plan their favorite movie nights, or suggest walks around Wildwood Hills. But each attempt was met with the same response. Emma would offer a faint smile, say she was too busy, and disappear back into her room, closing the door firmly behind her. It wasn't just family time that Emma was avoiding. She seemed to be withdrawing from everything she once enjoyed. Margaret noticed that Emma's friends had stopped coming by the house as frequently. The laughter and lively chatter that used to fill their home had been replaced by a strange silence, broken only by the occasional murmur of Emma's voice through her closed door. When Margaret asked her friends' mothers if they'd noticed anything different, they all said the same thing. Emma had been avoiding everyone lately, rarely answering messages and never making plans. One evening, as Margaret was cleaning up after dinner, she noticed Emma's phone left on the kitchen counter. The screen lit up with a message notification, and Margaret couldn't help but glance at it. The message read, "They won't find out if we're careful. Trust me." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that it was probably just a harmless conversation between teenagers. But a nagging feeling urged her to look further. She quickly unlocked the phone, scrolling up to read the conversation. The messages were vague but unsettling. Phrases like, "No witnesses," "Practice makes perfect," and "It's just a game" appeared throughout the chat history, each one more cryptic than the last. Before she could read more, she heard footsteps. Margaret quickly placed the phone back where she found it and busied herself with the dishes as Emma entered the kitchen, glancing at her phone before slipping it into her pocket. "Mom, is everything okay?" Emma asked, her voice neutral, almost as if she sensed something. Margaret forced a smile. "Yes, honey, just cleaning up. You left your phone on the counter." Emma's gaze lingered on her mother for a moment, her eyes cold and calculating, before she turned and walked back to her room without another word. Margaret watched her go, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was Emma talking to? And what were they planning? Over the next few days, Margaret's concern only grew. She tried to initiate conversations with Emma, asking about her day, her friends, her interests, but each attempt was met with the same disinterest. One afternoon, Margaret decided to approach her daughter directly. She found Emma sitting in her room, earbuds in, sketching in a notebook. Margaret knocked gently on the door, and Emma looked up, her expression unreadable. "Emma, I wanted to talk to you," Margaret began, choosing her words carefully. "I feel like you've been distant lately. Is everything okay?" Emma stared at her mother for a long moment before responding. "I'm fine, Mom. Just busy with school and other things." Margaret pressed gently. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? If something's bothering you or if you're struggling." Emma's expression hardened. "I said I'm fine. I don't need you to worry about me." The coldness in her daughter's voice sent a chill through Margaret. She took a step back, realizing that her presence was no longer welcome in Emma's world. As she left the room, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was losing her daughter, that the girl she once knew was gone. In the days that followed, Emma's behavior became even more disturbing. Margaret started noticing small acts of defiance, things that felt intentional, as if Emma were daring her to react. She would leave messes in the kitchen, ignore house rules, and stay out late without explanation. When Margaret asked about her whereabouts, Emma would shrug, offering vague answers that only fueled Margaret's unease. One evening, Margaret noticed a faint metallic smell coming from Emma's room. She hesitated before knocking, her hand hovering over the doorknob. When Emma opened the door, Margaret was met with a stony gaze, her daughter's face expressionless. "Do you need something?" Emma asked, her tone flat. Margaret stammered, trying to find an excuse. I thought I smelled something. Are you painting in here?" Emma raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk appearing on her lips. "Just working on a project," she replied, closing the door firmly, leaving Margaret standing in the hallway, her heart pounding. Unable to sleep that night, Margaret found herself pacing the house, her mind racing with thoughts of Emma's recent behavior. She replayed every strange conversation, every unsettling look, every vague response, searching for an explanation. Around midnight, she heard footsteps on the stairs. Margaret hid in the shadows, watching as Emma slipped out the front door, her figure disappearing into the night. Margaret felt a surge of panic, torn between following her and staying behind. She waited, her heart pounding, until Emma returned hours later, slipping back inside as silently as she had left. The next morning, Margaret confronted Emma about her late-night outings. "Where were you last night?" she asked, her voice strained. Emma's response was chilling. "Just out for a walk. I needed some space." The casualness in her tone, the lack of concern in her eyes, it all felt wrong. Margaret wanted to believe her, to dismiss her worries as overprotective paranoia, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. She could see it in Emma's eyes, in the way she moved, the way she spoke. Her daughter was hiding something dark and twisted. Margaret's unease had grown to the point of near obsession. Emma's coldness, her secretive behavior, the late-night disappearances, all of it haunted Margaret's thoughts every waking moment. The little girl she'd raised with love and patience seemed to be slipping further into a darkness Margaret couldn't reach. After another sleepless night, Margaret decided that she couldn't ignore the signs any longer. She had to know what was happening with her daughter, even if it meant uncovering truths she wasn't ready to face. It was early afternoon when Margaret found herself standing outside Emma's room, a sense of dread weighing down her steps. Emma had left for school and Greg was at work. Margaret took a deep breath, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. She'd always respected Emma's privacy, but her mother's intuition overruled her hesitation. Something was wrong, and she needed to know what. Inside, Emma's room was surprisingly neat, almost clinical. The blinds were drawn, casting the space in shadows, and the only light came from the faint glow of Emma's desk lamp. Margaret's eyes scanned the room, her heart pounding. She hesitated, feeling a pang of guilt, before stepping over to Emma's desk. As she opened the top drawer, a small black notebook caught her eye. She flipped it open, her breath hitching as she scanned the pages. Each one was filled with disturbing sketches, faces twisted in pain, eerie symbols, and phrases like, "They deserve it." And "No remorse" scrawled across the pages in bold letters. Her hands trembled as she turned each page, the drawings becoming darker and more violent. It felt like peering into a stranger's mind, a mind consumed by darkness. Margaret closed the notebook, feeling sick to her stomach. She wanted to believe that this was some twisted attempt at art, a form of expression. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. This was a window into Emma's mind, and the view was terrifying. Margaret moved to the closet, opening it slowly. Inside, she found another unsettling surprise. A collection of journals stacked neatly on the shelf, hidden behind a pile of clothes. She pulled one out, her fingers trembling as she opened it. The entries were written in Emma's careful, looping handwriting, but the content was anything but innocent. The pages described exercises and test runs, phrases that sounded like practice sessions, rehearsals for something sinister. Margaret's heart raced as she read through an entry about following someone from school, watching them, tracking their every move. Emma wrote about her feelings of power, of control, of being invisible in plain sight. Margaret's breath caught in her throat as she came to a more recent entry. "Tonight, I was close. They didn't see me, They never do. It's exhilarating. I know what I'm capable of now. The room felt as though it were closing in around her, the walls shrinking as her mind spun with the implications of what she was reading. Margaret forced herself to put the journal back, desperate to pretend she hadn't seen any of it, but the words were burned into her mind. I know what I'm capable of now. Margaret stumbled out of the room, her heart pounding as she closed the door behind her. She tried to rationalize what she'd seen, telling herself it had to be some sort of creative writing exercise, maybe even research for a school project. Emma had always been interested in true crime stories. Maybe this was her way of exploring that interest. But no matter how hard Margaret tried to convince herself, a part of her knew the truth. Emma wasn't just writing stories. She was documenting something real, something dangerous. As Margaret paced the living room, she wondered if she should tell Greg. But how could she explain what she'd found without sounding paranoid? And what if he dismissed her concerns like he always did, chalking it up to teenage rebellion? Margaret knew Greg loved Emma deeply, but he was practical to a fault, and she feared he wouldn't see the severity of the situation. The rest of the day passed in a haze, Margaret's mind racing as she replayed Emma's journal entries over and over. She felt trapped, unable to share her discovery, yet haunted by the darkness she'd uncovered. That evening, when Emma returned from school, Margaret felt a surge of anxiety. She watched her daughter move through the house, her expression calm, almost serene, as if nothing in the world could touch her. Margaret felt a strange mixture of fear and sorrow as she observed Emma, unable to reconcile the girl before her with the darkness she'd glimpsed in her journals. Desperate for answers, Margaret tried to talk to Emma again, hoping for even a sliver of the warmth they'd once shared. Emma, she began, her voice soft but pleading, I've noticed you've been different lately. Is everything okay? You know you can talk to me about anything. Emma looked up, her gaze steady and unflinching. I'm fine, Mom, she replied, her tone smooth and calm, almost rehearsed. You don't need to worry about me. Margaret's heart sank. There was an emptiness in Emma's eyes, a void that left her feeling cold and hollow. It was as if the girl she'd raised had been replaced by a stranger, someone who wore Emma's face but lacked her spirit. In the days that followed, Margaret became increasingly vigilant, watching Emma's every move. She noticed how Emma seemed to linger in the shadows, avoiding direct eye contact and slipping out of the house at odd hours. Margaret's worry had transformed into a full-blown obsession, her every thought consumed by the fear of what Emma might be doing. One evening, unable to resist any longer, Margaret decided to confront her husband. She told Greg about the notebooks, about the strange phrases and the unsettling entries. But as she feared, Greg dismissed her concerns. Margie, teenagers go through phases. She's probably just experimenting with dark poetry or something. Remember, she's always had an interest in mysteries. Let's not jump to conclusions. Margaret felt a pang of frustration. She wanted to scream, to make him understand the depth of her fear. But she held back, knowing that Greg wouldn't believe her unless he saw it for himself. Margaret's frustration reached a breaking point one night when she heard a noise coming from the garage. She slipped out of bed and crept downstairs, her heart pounding as she followed the faint sound. The garage door was ajar, and as she peered inside, she saw Emma standing by the workbench, carefully cleaning a long, thin knife. Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She stepped back, her mind racing with questions, her body frozen in place. Emma glanced up, catching her mother's reflection in the garage window, her face expressionless. Couldn't sleep, Mom? Emma asked, her tone casual, almost friendly. Margaret forced herself to breathe, steadying her voice. I thought I heard something. Emma's gaze lingered on her mother for a moment, a faint smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Don't worry, I'm just cleaning up. The casualness of her tone, the emptiness in her eyes, it was all too much. Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine as she turned and walked back inside, her mind racing with the implications of what she'd just witnessed. Driven by a need for answers, Margaret did what she'd never done before. She checked Emma's laptop while she was out of the house. Her hands trembled as she searched through Emma's files, eventually coming across a hidden folder marked Project X. Inside were screenshots of conversations, email exchanges, and notes, all with someone identified only as the mentor. The conversations were chilling. They read like a twisted form of guidance, instructions on how to observe people without being seen, how to manipulate others, and even how to quietly make someone disappear. Margaret's heart pounded as she scrolled through the messages, each one darker and more twisted than the last. This wasn't just a friend. This was a deliberate, calculated influence, someone who understood Emma's darkness and nurtured it. One message, in particular, stood out. It read, "They underestimate you, Emma. Let them. The world needs people like us to clean up the mess." Margaret felt her blood run cold. This mentor had become Emma's guide, feeding her warped ideas about control, punishment, and power. Margaret realized that her daughter wasn't just lost. She was being led down a dark path, her every move influenced by someone who understood her need for control, her craving for dominance. That evening, Margaret knew she couldn't keep this from Greg any longer. She sat him down in the living room, clutching a stack of printed screenshots in her shaking hands. "Greg," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "we need to talk about Emma. There's something terribly wrong." Greg looked at her, confusion and concern flickering across his face. "Margie, you're scaring me. What's going on?" Margaret handed him the screenshots, watching as his expression shifted from confusion to horror. "These are messages from someone who calls themselves the mentor," she explained. "They're encouraging Emma, guiding her, almost as if they're grooming her for something terrible." Greg's face went pale as he read the messages, his hand trembling. This can't be real. She's just a kid, Margie. Our Emma wouldn't hurt anyone." Margaret's voice broke as she replied, "I don't know who she is anymore, Greg. I feel like she's slipping away, and I don't know how to stop it." They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them like a shroud. Margaret suggested going to the police, but Greg was hesitant, fearing the implications for Emma and the family. Instead, they agreed to confront Emma, hoping that together, they could bring her back from the edge. Later that night, they called Emma into the living room. She entered with a calm expression, almost as if she'd been expecting this moment. Margaret held up the screenshots, her voice trembling as she asked, "Emma, who is the mentor? Why are they telling you these things?" Emma's face remained expressionless as she looked at her parents. She tilted her head slightly as if amused, then replied, "The mentor understands me. They see the truth about people, the lies, the hypocrisy. They know what the world really needs." Greg's voice was firm, almost pleading. "Emma, this isn't you. This isn't the girl we raised. Whoever this person is, they're using you. They're manipulating you." Emma's gaze turned icy, her voice calm but unsettling. "You don't understand, Dad. The mentor doesn't control me. They just help me see things clearly. People pretend to be good, but they're not. They hurt each other, lie, cheat, and steal. Someone has to do something about it." Margaret felt a tear slip down her cheek as she looked into her daughter's cold, unfeeling eyes. "Emma, please. This isn't the way. Whoever this mentor is, they're leading you down a dangerous path. Let us help you." Emma's expression softened, but only for a moment. "I don't need your help, Mom," she said quietly. "I know exactly what I'm doing." After Emma went back to her room, Margaret and Greg sat in the silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Margaret's heart ached, torn between fear for her daughter's safety and a growing sense of dread about what Emma might be capable of. Greg finally broke the silence. "We can't go to the police. Not yet. This is our daughter, Margie. We have to try to handle this ourselves first." Margaret nodded, though she wasn't entirely convinced. Part of her knew that involving the authorities might be the only way to protect Emma from herself, and to protect others from Emma. But she agreed to give it one more chance, hoping that somehow they could reach her without bringing her whole world crashing down. Over the next few days, Margaret became increasingly vigilant, watching Emma's every move and looking for signs of contact with the mentor. She'd hoped that the confrontation might snap Emma back to reality. But instead, it seemed to push her further away. Margaret even went so far as to restrict Emma's access to her phone and computer, hoping that cutting off her contact with the mentor might help. But Emma only grew more withdrawn, her anger simmering beneath the surface. Every interaction felt charged, as if Emma were waiting for the right moment to lash out, to release the tension building inside her. One evening, as Margaret was preparing dinner, she felt Emma's gaze on her from the doorway. Turning, she saw her daughter standing there, a faint smirk on her face. "Is everything all right, Emma?" Margaret asked cautiously. Emma shrugged, the smirk never leaving her lips. "I'm just watching, observing." Her voice was calm, detached. "You know, Mom, people don't realize how easy it is to get under someone's skin, to push them just enough, until they break." Margaret felt a shiver run down her spine as she looked into her daughter's eyes, realizing that the girl standing before her was no longer the sweet, innocent child she had once known. The mentor's influence had taken hold, and Emma was slipping further into a darkness Margaret feared she couldn't pull her back from. Margaret and Greg had tried everything they could think of to bring their daughter back from the edge. They'd restricted her access to the internet, limited her outings, and kept a close watch on her interactions. But nothing seemed to break Emma's connection with the shadowy figure known only as the mentor. Instead, Emma grew more withdrawn, more resentful, her presence in the house becoming almost ghostly. Every time Margaret looked at her daughter, she felt as though she was staring at a stranger, someone cold, calculating, and increasingly dangerous. Then one night, Greg noticed Emma sneaking down to the basement just past midnight. It wasn't the first time she'd slipped away under the cover of darkness, but this time, something compelled him to follow her. He felt an inexplicable sense of dread, a fear that had been building inside him ever since they'd confronted Emma about the mentor. Greg waited a few moments after Emma disappeared down the stairs, then quietly got out of bed. He tiptoed across the hallway, careful not to wake Margaret, and slowly opened the basement door. The stairs creaked beneath him as he made his way down, the faint glow of a flashlight illuminating the far corner of the room. He could see Emma's silhouette, her back to him, as she crouched over something on the floor. He moved closer, his heart pounding, straining to see what she was doing. Emma was carefully arranging a collection of objects on an old workbench, muttering under her breath. Greg's blood ran cold when he recognized some of the items, small trinkets, pieces of jewelry, and personal belongings that he knew didn't belong to anyone in their family. They looked familiar, though. He'd seen some of these things in missing persons reports on the local news. Greg watched in horror as Emma placed each item with meticulous care, treating them like trophies. He remembered the reports of people disappearing in Wildwood Hills and surrounding areas, people who had simply vanished without a trace. The items in front of him were all too similar to those that had been described by the families of the missing. A bracelet, a pair of glasses, a small keychain, each one belonged to someone who had disappeared. He stepped back, his mind racing with the implications of what he was seeing. Could Emma, his daughter, be connected to these disappearances? He didn't want to believe it, but the evidence was right in front of him. A sick feeling churned in his stomach as he backed away, desperate to leave the basement without being noticed. Just as he turned to leave, Emma's voice cut through the silence. "Dad?" Greg froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He turned slowly to see Emma watching him, her expression calm, almost amused. She held up a small locket, one he recognized from a recent missing persons case, and smiled. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, her voice unnervingly steady. Greg forced himself to respond, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought I heard something." Emma's eyes gleamed in the dim light. "Sometimes people don't realize the things they leave behind," she murmured, turning the locket over in her hand. "They're like little pieces of them, and I keep them, because they're mine now." Greg felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he backed up the stairs, his mind struggling to process what he had just seen. His little girl, the sweet child he had raised, was keeping trophies from people who had vanished, people who were likely never coming back. Back in the safety of their bedroom, Greg woke Margaret, his face pale and his hands shaking. He told her everything he'd seen, struggling to find the words to describe the horror unfolding in their basement. Margaret listened, her face growing more ashen with each word. No, Greg, this can't be true." She couldn't. But as the reality sank in, she felt a sickening certainty that he was right. Emma was connected to these disappearances, and the mentor was behind it all, shaping her, guiding her down a path of darkness. They sat together in silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. Margaret knew they had to do something. They couldn't keep this to themselves. But the idea of involving the police, of exposing Emma to the world, felt like a betrayal of their duty as parents. They'd always promised to protect her, to stand by her no matter what. But now, they were faced with an unthinkable choice: protect their daughter or protect the innocent lives that might be at risk. The next morning, Margaret decided to confront Emma directly, hoping against hope that there was an explanation, some way to understand what she'd seen. She found Emma in the kitchen, calmly making breakfast as if nothing had happened. "Emma," Margaret began, her voice barely steady, I saw what's in the basement. Those things, those people." Emma looked up, her expression unreadable. "Oh, you finally saw," she said, her tone almost mocking. "I was wondering how long it would take." Margaret's heart broke as she looked into her daughter's cold, detached eyes. "Emma, please, this isn't you. You're not a monster." Emma shrugged, her gaze unwavering. "Maybe you don't know me as well as you think, Mom. The mentor understands. They know what the world really needs." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face, her voice barely a whisper. "Emma, what has this person done to you? Why are you doing this?" Emma's face softened just for a moment. "Mom, you wouldn't understand. The world is full of people who take and hurt without a second thought. The mentor showed me that sometimes people need to be removed." Margaret's knees buckled as she clutched the countertop, the horror of her daughter's words crashing over her like a wave. Her baby, her sweet little girl, had become someone she didn't recognize, someone capable of unimaginable darkness. Unable to bear it any longer, Margaret and Greg decided that they had no choice but to go to the police. They couldn't allow Emma to continue down this path, no matter how much they loved her. But as they discussed their options that night, a chilling realization struck them. Emma would see it as a betrayal, an act of disloyalty. And with her connection to the mentor, they didn't know what she might be capable of if she found out. They agreed to wait, to gather as much information as they could before going to the authorities. But every moment they waited felt like a ticking time bomb, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them, threatening to shatter their family forever. Margaret and Greg had spent countless hours whispering behind closed doors, trying to decide what to do. Every moment that passed felt like a betrayal of Emma, but also a betrayal of their values, of the community, of the families who had lost their loved ones. They had always promised to protect their daughter, but now they found themselves in a battle between love and justice. And as their options narrowed, they realized there was only one path forward. They had to confront Emma. One evening, they called Emma into the living room. The air was thick with tension, and Margaret's heart pounded in her chest. She and Greg exchanged a silent glance, bracing themselves for what they were about to do. "Emma, we need to talk," Greg began, his voice steady but strained. Emma entered the room, her expression cool and detached. She seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, her gaze flicking between her parents. She settled into the armchair, crossing her legs and watching them with a faint, almost amused smile. Margaret took a shaky breath. "We know about the things in the basement, Emma. The belongings, the trophies, and we know about the mentor." For a moment, a flicker of surprise crossed Emma's face, quickly replaced by a look of calm indifference. She tilted her head, a glint of amusement in her eyes. "So you finally figured it out," she said, her voice calm and even. "I wondered how long it would take." The coldness of her response shattered Margaret's composure. "Emma, please, this isn't you," she pleaded, tears welling up in her eyes. "You're my little girl, the person who did these things. That can't be you." Emma's smile faded, her expression hardening. "Mom, you don't understand. You've never understood. The mentor showed me the truth. This world is full of people who don't deserve to be here, people who lie, steal, hurt others. They don't care about anyone but themselves." Greg's voice was barely above a whisper. "Emma, that's not for you to decide. Taking someone's life, it's not justice. It's wrong." Emma's gaze was icy, unyielding. "Wrong?" she repeated, her voice dripping with disdain. "You're blinded by your ideas of right and wrong. You're weak, just like the rest of them. The mentor understands that sometimes people have to be removed. They showed me that I'm strong enough to do what needs to be done." Margaret felt her stomach turn as she looked into her daughter's eyes. Eyes that once held innocence, love, and warmth, now filled with a darkness she couldn't recognize. "Emma, please, let us help you. We can get through this together, but you have to let go of this person, this mentor. They're using you. They don't care about you, not really." For the first time, Emma's expression softened, a flash of vulnerability breaking through her icy exterior. But it was fleeting. She shook her head, her face hardening once more. "You're wrong, Mom. The mentor cares more about me than you ever could. They understand what I'm capable of. They see the potential in me, the strength." Emma leaned back, crossing her arms as she continued. "You think I'm just following orders, but I know exactly what I'm doing. Every single one of them deserved it. They were all pathetic, selfish, and cruel. They didn't deserve the lives they had." Margaret's heart broke as she listened to her daughter's words, each one driving a knife deeper into her soul. She couldn't reconcile this cold, calculating person with the daughter she'd raised, the little girl she'd once rocked to sleep and kissed goodnight. "Emma," Greg said, his voice barely steady, "what you're doing, it isn't justice. It's murder. And if you keep going, you're going to ruin your life. You're going to hurt yourself and everyone who loves you." Emma's expression was unreadable as she looked at her father. "You think I care about that?" she replied, her voice dripping with disdain. "You think I care about hurting people who are too weak to see the truth? You're just as blind as the rest of them." Margaret felt desperation clawing at her as she tried one last time to reach her daughter. "Emma, I know you're angry. I know you're hurt. But this isn't the answer. This mentor, whoever they are, they're using you for their own gain. You're not their protege. You're their pawn." Emma's face contorted with anger, her eyes blazing with fury. "You don't know anything about the mentor," she hissed. "They believe in me. They understand me, and they're helping me become who I was always meant to be." Margaret's voice trembled as she replied, "Emma, that person doesn't care about you. They're manipulating you, using you for their own twisted purposes. Please, let us help you. Let us bring you back." For a moment, Emma seemed to waver, her resolve weakening. Margaret could see the flicker of doubt in her eyes, a hint of the girl she once knew. But then, just as quickly, the coldness returned, and Emma's face hardened into a mask of indifference. "It's too late, Mom," she said, her voice chillingly calm. "I've already made my choice. You'll never understand, and I don't need your help." As the confrontation ended, Emma rose from her chair, her face devoid of emotion. "I'm going to my room," she said simply, her tone flat and final. "Don't follow me." Margaret and Greg watched her go, their hearts breaking as they realized the full extent of their daughter's transformation. The sweet, loving child they had raised was gone, replaced by someone they couldn't recognize. A stranger who saw the world through a lens of darkness and contempt. Once Emma was gone, Margaret broke down, tears streaming down her face. Greg held her close, his own eyes filled with grief and despair. They had tried to reach her, to bring her back from the edge, but it was clear that Emma had chosen her path, and nothing they said could change her mind. After Emma disappeared into her room, Margaret and Greg sat together in silence, the weight of the confrontation settling over them like a storm cloud. They knew they couldn't keep this secret any longer. Emma was a danger to herself and to others, and they had exhausted every avenue, every possible way to reach her. Finally, Greg spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to go to the police." Margaret's heart sank as she realized the truth of his words. They had no other choice. If they didn't act now, more lives could be at risk, and the burden of that knowledge would haunt them forever. "We'll go tomorrow," Margaret replied, her voice breaking. "But we have to be careful. Emma can't know if she finds out." Greg nodded, understanding the implications. They were walking a tightrope, balancing between love and duty, between their role as parents and their responsibility to protect the community. They knew that going to the authorities would shatter their family, but they couldn't allow Emma's darkness to continue unchecked. As they prepared for the difficult road ahead, Margaret and Greg held each other, their hearts heavy with grief and dread. They had loved their daughter with everything they had, but now they were faced with the unthinkable. And as they sat in the silence, they knew that the hardest part was still to come. Margaret and Greg barely slept after the confrontation with Emma. They lay awake, haunted by her cold, unwavering gaze and the conviction in her voice. They had made the painful decision to go to the authorities, but a lingering fear gnawed at them. What if Emma found out? What if she retaliated? The next morning, just as they were steeling themselves to go to the police, there was a knock at the door. Margaret's heart skipped a beat as she glanced out the window, noticing a figure she didn't recognize standing on the porch. He was dressed sharply, with a calm demeanor that felt both familiar and unsettling. Greg opened the door, his expression guarded. "Can I help you?" The man smiled, stepping into the doorway. "My name is Mr. Crane. I'm a friend of Emma's." His eyes glinted with a subtle intensity that sent a chill through both Margaret and Greg. "Emma never mentioned you," Margaret said, her voice careful but laced with suspicion. Mr. Hutt, Crane's smile widened slightly. "Emma and I share a unique understanding," he replied smoothly. "I wanted to come by to check on her, to see how things are going. I know she's been under some pressure lately." Margaret felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach. She didn't need to ask who he was. This was the mentor. This man was the one who had lured Emma into the darkness, the person who had twisted her mind and led her down this dangerous path. She had always imagined the mentor as some anonymous, shadowy figure lurking behind a computer screen. But seeing him in person, standing in her doorway, made everything feel more real, more terrifying. Mr. Crane's gaze lingered on Margaret, as though he could read her thoughts. "Emma's spoken very highly of you both," he said, his tone smooth and calm. "She told me how understanding you've been, how you've supported her journey." Margaret forced herself to remain calm, even as her heart pounded in her chest. "We love our daughter, Mr. Crane," she replied, her voice steady. "But we don't approve of what she's doing. We know about the disappearances, about the things she's been keeping in the basement." Mr. Crane's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, a flash of satisfaction. "Emma is a remarkable young woman. She has potential beyond what most people can imagine. I've simply helped her realize her true self." Greg stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You manipulated her. You filled her head with lies, convinced her that she was above everyone else." Mr. Crane held up a hand, his calm demeanor never wavering. "I didn't convince her of anything. Emma came to these realizations on her own. I simply provided a framework for her to understand the world." Margaret's voice broke as she said, "She's our daughter, Mr. Crane. She's not yours to control." For the first time, Mr. Crane's expression hardened, his gaze sharpening. "You have no idea what Emma is capable of, the potential she has. You're holding her back, and she resents you for it. She's ready to move beyond your limitations." Mr. Crane took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You've put her in a difficult position. She knows you don't support her, and if you act against her, she will see it as betrayal. You don't want to know what Emma is capable of when she feels betrayed." Margaret's heart raced as she listened, fear twisting in her stomach. "Are you threatening us?" Mr. Crane's smile returned, but there was a coldness in his eyes. "I'm simply giving you advice. You have a choice. You can support Emma, allow her to fulfill her potential, or you can interfere and face the consequences. But understand this, Emma's loyalty lies with me now." Greg's voice was barely a whisper. "She's our daughter. She doesn't belong to you." Mr. Crane's gaze was steady, unyielding. "Then why is she turning to me for guidance? Why does she trust me more than she trusts her own family?" Margaret felt a surge of anger and despair. This man had taken her daughter, twisted her, transformed her into someone unrecognizable. And now he was standing in their home, taunting them, daring them to defy him. Just as the tension reached its peak, Emma entered the room, her expression calm and composed. She looked between her parents and Mr. Crane, a faint smile tugging at her lips. "Mr. Crane," she said warmly, her tone laced with a familiarity that made Margaret's stomach turn. "I didn't know you'd be stopping by." Mr. Crane smiled back, his gaze softening as he looked at her. "I wanted to see how things were going, Emma. It seems there's been a bit of tension." Emma's gaze shifted to her parents, her eyes cold and unfeeling. "Yes, there has been," she replied, her tone flat. "They don't understand." Mr. Crane nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They may not understand now, but in time they might. They just need to see things from your perspective." Margaret felt a lump in her throat as she watched her daughter interact with this man. It was as though Emma had become a different person, someone who belonged to Mr. Crane, who looked up to him, who trusted him more than she trusted her own parents. As Mr. Crane and Emma talked, exchanging looks and words that shut out everyone else in the room, Margaret felt a wave of sadness and horror wash over her. She could see it clearly now. Emma was gone, claimed by this man who had twisted her mind and heart. The sweet, loving girl she had raised was buried under layers of darkness and manipulation, molded into something unrecognizable. When Mr. Crane finally left, he gave them one last warning. Remember, it's better to support her than to fight her. You don't want to be on the wrong side of Emma's loyalty. As he walked out the door, Margaret and Greg were left standing in silence, their hearts heavy with despair. They knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that they had lost Emma to this man. They had only one choice left, to go to the authorities before it was too late. But as they looked at each other, a new fear dawned on them. They knew they had to be careful, that even the smallest slip could alert Emma, and if she found out, they couldn't predict what she might do. The morning after Mr. Crane's chilling visit, Margaret and Greg made their way to the police station in silence, hearts heavy with fear and uncertainty. Every mile that took them closer to the station felt like a betrayal of their daughter. But they knew it was the only way to protect her and others from the path she had chosen. They had to act quickly, before Mr. Crane's influence pushed her to do something irreversible. Inside the police station, Margaret and Greg were led into a small, quiet room by Detective Marshall, a seasoned officer with a kind but serious demeanor. Margaret's hands trembled as she handed over the evidence she had collected, screenshots of the messages from the mentor, notes from Emma's journal, and photos of the items she'd found hidden in the basement. Detective Marshall examined the evidence carefully, his brow furrowing with each new piece of information. Finally, he looked up at Margaret and Greg, his expression grim. "This is serious," he said quietly. "If what you're saying is true, your daughter is involved in some very dangerous activities. But we need to proceed carefully. If she senses we're onto her, she could react unpredictably, possibly violently." Greg's voice was strained as he replied, "We just want to help her. We don't want her to end up in a place she can't come back from." The detective nodded, sympathy in his eyes. "We'll do everything we can to handle this delicately. But given the influence of this mentor, it's clear that Emma's not acting alone. We'll need to investigate him as well. Do you know his real name or where we might find him?" Margaret shook her head, her voice barely a whisper. "He's called Mr. Crane. He showed up at our house yesterday, warning us to stay out of Emma's way." The detective's face darkened. "If this man is involved, we'll make it our priority to find him. He sounds like a predator, manipulating vulnerable people to carry out his own twisted vision." As they left the station, Margaret felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, with the help of the police, they could save Emma before it was too late. But fear still gnawed at her heart, a fear that only grew stronger as they approached home. When they returned, Emma was waiting for them in the living room, her expression unreadable. She looked at her parents, her gaze sharp and probing, as if she could sense that something had shifted. "Where were you?" she asked, her tone calm but with an edge that sent a shiver down Margaret's spine. Margaret tried to keep her voice steady, forcing a smile. "Just out running some errands. Thought we'd grab a coffee." Emma's gaze lingered on her mother, a flicker of suspicion in her eyes. "I see." She turned her attention to Greg, studying him just as closely. "You both seem tense." Greg forced a chuckle, his voice a little too loud. "It's just been a long morning, that's all. Nothing to worry about." Emma watched them in silence, her gaze unrelenting. Margaret felt her heart pounding as the silence stretched on, each second making her more certain that Emma knew they'd gone to the police. But after a long, agonizing pause, Emma finally stood up, her expression inscrutable. "I'm going for a walk," she said simply, her voice devoid of warmth. "Don't wait up." As the door closed behind her, Margaret let out a shaky breath, relief mingling with dread. She glanced at Greg, who looked just as shaken as she felt. "She knows something's up," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "If she figures out what we've done." Margaret nodded, a cold chill settling over her. "We just have to hope the police move fast. If she confronts us, I don't know what she'll do." Hours passed with no sign of Emma, each moment filled with mounting tension. Margaret tried to distract herself, but her mind kept drifting back to the memories of her sweet little girl, the child who used to sing in the car, who held her hand on walks, who brought laughter into their home. Now, that girl was a stranger, someone who might see her parents as enemies, all because of Mr. Crane's influence. Just before midnight, Margaret's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and felt her heart stop. It was a message from Emma, just 3 chilling words. "I know everything." Margaret's hands shook as she showed the message to Greg. She knows we went to the police." Greg took a deep breath, trying to keep his composure. "We need to stay calm. She might just be bluffing. We have to hope the detective will have news soon." But deep down, they both knew that Emma didn't bluff. She was calculated, methodical, and if she had said she knew everything, it was because she did. A few minutes later, the front door creaked open, and Emma stepped inside. Her expression was icy, her eyes filled with a quiet fury that made Margaret's blood run cold. She looked at her parents, her gaze penetrating, and there was a hardness in her face they had never seen before. "You went to the police," she said flatly, her voice devoid of emotion. "I trusted you, and you went behind my back." Margaret's voice trembled as she replied, "Emma, we did it because we love you. We wanted to help you, to protect you from him." Emma's lip curled in disdain. "Protect me? From Mr. Crane? You have no idea what you're talking about. He's the only one who understands me. He's the only one who sees my potential." Greg stepped forward, his tone pleading. "Emma, this man has brainwashed you. He's manipulating you, using you for his own sick goals. Can't you see that?" Emma shook her head, her gaze cold and unyielding. "No, Dad, he's not using me. He's helping me become who I was meant to be. And you've both betrayed me. You're no different from the people we've removed, the people who poison this world." Margaret felt tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Emma, please, we did this because we love you. We didn't want to lose you." Emma's eyes flashed with anger, her fists clenched. "You already have." Before Margaret or Greg could react, Emma turned and stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Margaret rushed to follow, but by the time she reached the door, Emma was gone, swallowed up by the darkness. Margaret's heart raced as she realized the gravity of the situation. Emma was out there, angry, feeling betrayed, and possibly seeking vengeance. They called Detective Marshall, frantically explaining the situation. The detective assured them that they would begin a search immediately, warning them to stay inside and remain vigilant. Margaret's mind spun with fear and regret as she clutched the phone, her heart breaking at the thought of her daughter out there, lost in a world of darkness and lies. Emma walked through the empty streets, her mind racing. Her parents, the people she had once trusted above all others, had betrayed her. They had gone to the police, tried to sabotage everything she had worked toward. Her anger simmered as she clutched her phone, staring at the message from the mentor that had arrived moments after she left her house. "Come to the place we discussed. It's time to take the final step." She made her way to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town, a location she and Mr. Crane had scouted weeks ago. He had hinted at it as a possible meeting place, a safe location to carry out projects without interference. Tonight, it felt ominous, like the final stage of some twisted initiation. When Emma arrived, she found Mr. Crane waiting for her, leaning against the wall with a calm, almost pleased expression. He extended his hand, a fatherly gesture that filled her with a sense of belonging she had lost with her parents. He was the only one who understood her now, the only one who believed in her potential. "Emma," he greeted her softly, his eyes gleaming. "I knew you'd come." She took his hand, feeling a surge of pride. "They don't understand, Mr. Crane. My parents, they betrayed me. They went to the police." Mr. Crane's face softened in mock sympathy. "I'm sorry, Emma. Sometimes, even those closest to us are too limited to see the truth. They don't understand your strength, your purpose, but I do." Emma nodded, her anger subsiding as she felt the validation she craved. "I know you do. I'm ready to take the final step, to prove myself." Mr. Crane led her inside the warehouse, dimly lit and filled with the eerie hum of silence. "Tonight, you will show me just how committed you are," he said, his voice low and controlled. "But there's one last thing you need to do. Emma's gaze sharpened, eager to please him. "What is it?" He pulled out a small, untraceable phone and handed it to her. "I want you to call your parents. Tell them where you are. Tell them you want to talk. Tell them you're ready to come home." Emma's heart raced at the thought of seeing her parents, of confronting them face to face. She hesitated, confused. "But they'll bring the police." Mr. Crane smiled, his eyes gleaming with a sinister light. "Exactly. Let them come. Tonight is about proving that you are beyond their control, that you are loyal to our cause above all else. This is your moment to sever the ties that bind you to them." Emma's mind raced, torn between her loyalty to Mr. Crane and the remnants of the love she once held for her parents. But the thought of their betrayal, of their desperate attempts to stop her, hardened her resolve. She took the phone, dialing her mother's number with steady hands. At home, Margaret and Greg sat in tense silence, anxiously awaiting news from the police. When Margaret's phone rang, she nearly dropped it, her heart pounding as she saw Emma's name on the screen. "Emma?" Margaret answered, her voice trembling. "Lam." Emma's voice was calm, almost emotionless. "I'm ready to come home. I just want to talk, to explain everything." Margaret's heart surged with hope. "Emma, sweetheart, we just want to help you. Please, just tell us where you are." "I'm at the old warehouse off Mill Road," Emma replied, her voice steady. "Come alone. No police." Margaret looked at Greg, her eyes filled with fear. "We'll be there soon, Emma," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Just stay safe, please." As the call ended, Margaret immediately called Detective Marshall, explaining the situation. She knew Emma had asked them not to bring the police, but she couldn't risk going without protection. The detective assured her they would follow at a safe distance, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. Back at the warehouse, Mr. Crane observed Emma, his gaze approving. "You did well. Now when they arrive, you will show them who you really are. This is the moment that defines you, Emma. The moment you sever the last ties to your former self." Emma nodded, feeling a strange mix of excitement and dread. She had idolized Mr. Crane, followed his every command, but as she stood in the dark, waiting for her parents, a flicker of doubt crept into her mind. Her parents had betrayed her, yes, but they had also raised her, loved her. For a brief moment, the memory of her mother's warm embrace, her father's proud smile, surfaced in her mind. But before she could dwell on it, Mr. Crane's hand rested on her shoulder, his grip firm. "Don't waver now, Emma. Tonight you prove your loyalty to me." Margaret and Greg arrived at the warehouse, their faces pale, filled with equal parts fear and hope. They called out for Emma, their voices echoing in the vast, empty space. When she stepped out from the shadows, they could see the hard look in her eyes, the coldness that replaced the warmth they once knew. "Emma," Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes. "Please, let's go home. We can work through this together." But before Emma could respond, Mr. Crane emerged from the shadows, his expression a mixture of pride and malice. "Emma doesn't belong to you anymore," he said, his voice calm and threatening. "She's chosen her path, a path you cannot follow." Greg stepped forward, his fists clenched. "You've poisoned her mind, twisted everything good in her. She's our daughter, not your puppet." Mr. Crane smirked, looking at Emma. "Show them, Emma. Show them you're no longer bound by their weakness." Emma hesitated, her eyes flickering between her parents and Mr. Crane. The weight of the moment pressed down on her, a decision that would define her future. The doubt from earlier resurfaced, stronger this time. She glanced back at her parents, their faces filled with love and desperation, and for the first time she felt something crack within her. "Emma," Margaret whispered, stepping forward. "Please come back to us. We love you." Mr. Crane's face hardened, his voice a low command. "Emma, don't let their weakness infect you. You know what must be done." Emma's hands trembled as she looked between her parents and Mr. Crane. Her loyalty to the mentor had been absolute, but now, in the presence of her parents, doubt gnawed at her. She could feel the weight of her choices, the darkness that had consumed her, and the realization that Mr. Crane had never cared for her, only for the power he could wield through her. With a surge of clarity, Emma turned to Mr. Crane, her voice filled with defiance. "No, I won't do this." Mr. Crane's face twisted in anger. "You're weak, just like them. You were nothing before I found you." Emma's gaze hardened, the remnants of the love she held for her family overpowering the grip he once held over her. "You're wrong. I was never nothing." At that moment, the police swarmed the warehouse, Detective Marshall leading the charge. Mr. Crane tried to escape, but he was quickly subdued, his calm facade finally shattered. Emma stood motionless, watching as the man she once revered was handcuffed and taken away, his voice fading into the distance. As the chaos subsided, Emma looked at her parents, her expression filled with guilt and shame. Margaret stepped forward, wrapping her arms around her daughter, her tears flowing freely. Greg joined them, holding them both as Emma began to break down, the weight of her actions crashing over her like a tidal wave. "I'm so sorry," Emma whispered, her voice choked with tears. "I didn't see it, I didn't know." Margaret stroked her hair, her own tears falling. "We're here, Emma. We'll get through this together." The days following Mr. Crane's arrest were a whirlwind of questions, interrogations, and intense media scrutiny. The story of a manipulative figure luring a young girl into darkness had gripped the town and spilled into the national news, shocking everyone in Wildwood Hills. But at the heart of the storm was the Griffin family, fractured yet trying desperately to heal. Emma was brought in for questioning, her parents by her side. She was painfully honest about everything, the things she had done, the people she had followed, the items she had collected as trophies. Her eyes were hollow as she recounted her journey into the abyss, her voice raw with regret. Because of her age and the evident psychological manipulation Mr. Crane had wielded over her, the court treated Emma's case with care. She was placed under psychiatric evaluation and given a chance at rehabilitation rather than prison. Margaret and Greg watched helplessly as their daughter was led away, their hearts heavy with both sorrow and hope. "Mom, Dad, I'm sorry," Emma had whispered, her voice breaking as they took her to the treatment center. "I didn't understand what I was doing. I thought I was strong." Greg placed a hand on her shoulder, his own voice thick with emotion. "You are strong, Emma. You're strong for facing this now. We're with you, every step of the way." As Emma was taken inside, Margaret and Greg clung to each other, knowing their daughter's journey was only beginning. In the quiet weeks that followed, Margaret often found herself replaying the memories of Emma's childhood, haunted by the lingering question, how had they missed the signs? She combed through every memory, every moment of Emma's childhood, searching for answers that might explain how her sweet little girl had become susceptible to such darkness. She found herself speaking with Detective Marshall often, seeking reassurance and perspective. "Sometimes," he told her gently, "manipulators like Mr. Crane find those who are vulnerable, those searching for purpose or direction. They prey on them, slowly pulling them in." Emma was just unlucky enough to be in his path. Margaret nodded, but the guilt remained, a burden she knew she'd carry for the rest of her life. She poured herself into research on psychological recovery, determined to understand the process that Emma would go through, hoping to be prepared for the person Emma might become as she healed. Greg's response to the ordeal was quieter but no less intense. He threw himself into repairing the family's home, trying to scrub away the memories of Emma's dark days. He repainted her room, removed the contents of the basement, and slowly dismantled the places where shadows lingered. But late at night, when Margaret was asleep, he would sit alone, grappling with his own guilt and anger. He wanted to blame Mr. Crane entirely, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he, too, had played a part. Had he been too dismissive when Margaret voiced her concerns? Had he chosen ignorance over action when the signs began to emerge? In time, he found solace in therapy, encouraged by Detective Marshall and friends who had reached out to support him. Slowly, he began to forgive himself, recognizing that even the most vigilant parents can't foresee or prevent every danger. In the treatment center, Emma was assigned a therapist who specialized in cases of manipulation and psychological control. She found herself opening up about her relationship with Mr. Crane, how he had convinced her that she was special, destined to fulfill a role that others couldn't understand. At first, the guilt and shame were overwhelming. She could barely look her therapist in the eyes, struggling to reconcile the person she had become with the child her parents had raised. But as the weeks went on, she began to recognize Mr. Crane's influence, the way he had warped her thoughts, drawing her deeper into his twisted worldview. One evening, during a session, her therapist asked her a simple question. "What do you want your life to look like, Emma?" The question lingered in her mind for days, sparking a glimmer of hope she hadn't felt in months. For the first time, she realized she had the power to choose, to rebuild, to create a life separate from the darkness that had consumed her. Months later, after intense therapy and a newfound sense of purpose, Emma was allowed a supervised visit home. Margaret and Greg prepared the house, nervous and unsure of what to expect. They had written letters to her during her time away, but they hadn't seen her face to face since that night at the warehouse. When Emma walked through the door, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. Her daughter looked older, wearier, but there was a clarity in her eyes, a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Hi, Mom. Hi, Dad," Emma said softly, her voice filled with emotion. Margaret rushed forward, wrapping her arms around Emma as tears filled her eyes. Greg joined them, his own voice breaking as he said, "Welcome home, sweetheart." They sat together for hours, talking openly for the first time about everything that had happened, their words filled with both sorrow and hope. Emma apologized repeatedly, her voice choked with regret, but her parents assured her that they were ready to move forward, to support her in her journey of healing. Over the following months, Emma continued her therapy, working with counselors who helped her build a life beyond her past. She volunteered at community centers, sharing her story with other young people to help them recognize the dangers of manipulation and coercion. Margaret and Greg, too, found ways to heal, attending support groups for families affected by trauma and gradually rebuilding their lives. They became advocates for mental health and awareness, speaking to parents and communities about the importance of vigilance, compassion, and understanding. Their family, though forever changed, had found a way to move forward, bound by a love that had survived even the darkest trials. Emma had come back to them, scarred but determined, and together they faced the future with resilience and a newfound strength.